Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So put on your headsets and let's go again for a 1-hour roundtable. Thank you for coming this afternoon at EnerGaïa. So this roundtable is about repowering for solar farms, re-equipping and revamping. So after wind turbines, we're going to talk about solar farms and the second life of these farms. Remember, in 2006 was the beginning of PV farms in France, because we forced the purchase of kilowatt hours with a guarantee from the state, and this price that allowed investments to be viable and profitable, first on roofing in 2006, and then in 2010, ground-mounted stations. It's been 20 years, and some of the constraints, in 5 years, we've got to start to replace them, and we're also starting to replace ground-mounted material, more or less in large scale. It's a market that is creating jobs and could bring extra gigawatts to France and Europe without excess land area needed, thanks to a better productivity of these modules for the same surface area. So with our guests, we'll talk about the definition of this repowering, with some people speaking from the world of business, technical point of views, and the legalese behind all this. Two consequences. First, we'll speak with all of our guests, and then we'll have a Q&A session with you where we can discuss this. You can send me your questions by scanning the QR code on the screen where I receive your questions. And if we're good on timing, we'll have another Q&A where you raised your hands, and we've got an actual microphone for those who prefer that. So I would like to welcome Antoine Laforgue, who is the General Director of Fiji, who is intervening at the very last minute for his president, Harold Derras. Thank you so much for coming and being with us. Alan Conrad, who's the Director of Operations and Maintenance at Luxel, and who is a Jean-Baptiste Batuste, who is a lawyer for repowering and revamping, who will tell us what the difference is. Hello, and thank you for giving us information about this question. So we're going to start with you, Hélène Men. You're a lawyer working in Montpellier, and for 5 years we've been working around energy rights, which includes questions about urbanization, tariffs, wind turbines, stocking, PV stocking. These are where you're a specialist. Your clients are developers of renewable energy, but also banks, and you help them for financial audits in their projects, and you intervene also on contentious disagreements. Briefly, you've been looking at this subject, repowering, for PV farms by analyzing them as a legal expert. What have you learned? And is there a definition to distinguish repowering versus maintenance? Maybe that's what revamping is, which is a heavy-duty maintenance of some kind. What are the legal rules? Can you give us the context and what are the limitations of this definition? So to come back to this idea, we're using the word repowering, renewal, revamping, except these are ideas that are more economical and practical rather than legal. Legally speaking, I don't have a clear definition or ability to distinction when we talk about repowering or simply heavy-duty maintenance. I think with the other speakers could say it better than me, but we talk about repowering when we want to increase the amount of power. But in solar farms, from a regulatory point of view, no matter the increase in power, this is not a criteria that the state is affected by, or when they're creating urbanization instructions. So there's no clear definition. In the text, we talk about re-equipping, but this word isn't used orally when speaking about this. It's not as, let's say, meaningful as repowering, but there's no real legal definition of these words. When we talk about urbanization, what are the obligations when we want to re-equip a solar plant? So we talk about repowering with wind turbines. This is a real definition. As a lawyer, what's different? For repowering for wind turbines, we have the legal framework is more simple, better established. We've got rules that allow us to distinguish or identify criteria, what's a substantial modification, notable modification, but wind turbines have an authorization, which is an environmental authorization, in its construction and its operation and throughout its lifespan. So within this framework, if we change a rotor, if we increase the size, we need an existing authorization. We bring this information to the administration, and there's a document that needs to be given to receive this environmental authorization. When we modify a project, the administration needs to have knowledge of this, and they can add additional criteria if they think there's important risks. So that's throughout the lifespan of a wind turbine. However, with solar farms, there's a few, but we won't go into the detail, but the main authorization is urbanization, and that authorization is, yes, you have the right to create your farm. It's a one-shot for the construction, but it doesn't oversee the life of the park and the life of the farm over time. So we're trying to change that. We don't know if we're talking about roofing. For example, if you're changing your windows or you're changing your solar panels, it's kind of the same thing. But for a solar farm that's ground-mounted, it's not as clear. Have you seen building permits at times? I think we'd have to look at everything, start over again. Who decides currently? We don't have a lot of information or indicators, so we need to, of course, discuss them with the prefecture and the local authorities that are authorizing these ground-mounted solar farms, in particular for these large farms, because a time will come where we think that we don't need a building permit. But it's better that that be written, because otherwise no bank is going to finance the equipment of a farm without the urbanization authorization. Someone has to guarantee that we don't need a new authorization, or sometimes ask for a new permit. For us, where it's difficult to make a distinction, at the end of the day, we're saying, well, I'm only replacing a few panels. I'm not touching the structure. Do I really need it? But on total, when we re-equip the entire farm, we'll increase the power. We need a new substack, a new substation. We'll add in inventory stocking, because that's quite a trendy thing. And it's trendy to stock the energy because it's necessary. But it's rather rare in practice, and maybe others can confirm this. It's rare to do so little things, so few things that we would not need to involve local authorities or the administration. We'll come back to that. Alain Conrad, over to you. You're the director of operations and maintenance at Luxel, a company created 17 years ago, so located in Montpellier with your headquarters, that integrated EDF a few years ago. So now it's called EDF Power Solutions. Luxel historically is one of the first French operators of ground-mounted systems in 2010. And the repowering of these power plants is going to take place. So we'd like to hear your experience on a very specific case We're going to briefly tell the story. Less than 2 years ago, you coordinated what is undoubtedly one of the first large-scale repowering of a ground-mounted photovoltaic power plant in France. It was in Lafitte-sur-Lot, in the Lot-et-Garonne, as the name suggests. At first, your role was as a operator and maintenance of the 7.8 megawatt plant, and it's increased since then, but at that time, and that's already a lot. And
Et la détection, elle a été mise en service en 2013.
in 2013, you've detected insulation faults, and that happened 5 years later. What gradually led to the decision to replace almost everything, and how did it actually happen? Just a few words about Luxel for those who don't know it. We were created in 2008, based in Montpellier. We work all over France. Just a few numbers: 2 gigawatts of pipes being developed, 350 megawatts of projects being constructed, and more than 500 megawatts of projects currently running and being maintained. 2/3 of these 500 megawatts are sites owned by Luxel, and 1/3 are projects that we're not owners of, and it's the case of this, just to give you the context. As you were saying, this site was up and running into the 12th of December 2013, so it's been almost 12 years. After a few years, we saw some flaws in the insulation. We see that elsewhere. Like, black spots that you see, it's mainly undulated. So they detect that the limitations are too weak, and in the inverters, it generally comes from cables. So we saw that it did not come from the HDC cables, but it came from the solar panels themselves. And so it's something that we do progressively. We don't imagine right away that we're going to do a total repowering. A few months went by, everything went better. In summer, there was no flaws, but every winter we see more and more of these flaws. We investigate, we take measures at different locations at the plant. We observe. You see the metal blackening. We try to speak to the clients, saying something's wrong on your farm, and we're going to have to do something important because we need their support with the person who supplied the panels, the solar panels, because we've got to warn them. And most importantly, we want them to cover the cost, and we want them to intervene in the diagnosis. And we continue doing this. We send panels to labs that are specialized, that do very specific analysis, and there's many of these labs and technologies that exist today. So microscopic exams, rotoscopic, etc. And then we realized that the backside of the panels were not had micro cracks, so that the permeability they were permeable, and humidity would go in. The inverter detects that there's some kind of flaw, and they just stop. So that took us quite some time, months, years, in fact. The person who constructed, the constructor of the module, agrees that something's wrong. They send their own teams out. They first suggest a partial replacement only of the panels that are the most affected. So there's a classification. The serial numbers are used. Out of 32,000 panels, you can imagine how complicated this analysis is. And then the solution was making the decision to replace the 32,000 panels, because sooner or later they will all be affected. From this experience, for your own, where you're owners of certain farms, were there certain warning signs, some alerts? We're going from simply changing a few panels in one line, or you need to do more, and we could use the word repowering. What lessons have you learned? Well, for us, it was a relief to know that they were going to replace everything, because Well, it's true that the flaws were so obvious and all over the site, and we were intervening, and we don't even know everywhere, basically. So making this decision to replace all of the panels was a good thing for us.
Pas forcément nos équipes après qui intervenaient.
And it wasn't our teams. Then we had specialized companies who are used to this type of construction site and large-scale replacement. Thank you. So now we're going to Antoine Laforgue. So you're the general director at Fiji. Thank you for coming so quickly. Because your president, Harold, could not be here. So you're an independent company. The headquarters is located in Paris. That's 10 years old. But you're focused on optimization of existing photovoltaic systems, starting with rooftops and those of farmers, which is essential for you. You published a book with our colleagues of France Agriculture, but you also work on repowering for the ground-mounted power plants, and you also developed an offer of panels for agrovoltaics. You're going to speak about your solutions for repowering. But I do have a question. What justifies moving from sporadic equipment replacement to the notion of repowering, which suggests a complete change? So I think Alain answered that question. Let me just say who Fiji is. We're a company specialized in repowering. More than 400 projects in France with farmers for rooftops and also ground-mounted plants. But to answer your question, I think it's exactly what you described. When we see the material being degraded and lower performances that are too important and that are a safety risk, we know that that's the tipping point, and we've got to imagine how to repower. And it's also an opportunity. And maybe we'll speak about this a bit later, but it's a means to develop renewable energy in a simple, economical way and without taking up more land or using up more roofs. I know you've got digital solutions, and we're not going to go into the detail, but you can, some of the key points, how you work. We can see there's a roof here, but you can imagine if that's on the ground, it'd be the same thing. The small rectangle to the left with blue, that is blue and orange, with the same surface area, how much do we multiply the power? What you need to keep in mind is that the panels today are their performance is much better than those of 10, 15 years ago, in the sense that they produce more electricity per square meter than the previous panels. From what to what? So in surface area savings, if we compare things to 10 years ago, 30 or 35% of the total land area being used, maybe more sometimes. It depends on what the initial panels being used were. So when we're going to replace the plant for the identical amount of power, or we can increase it by 10%, because we can increase it by 10% as based on the initial power, as compared to the initial contract as well. So there's going to be space left over, and this available space, we can create a new plant on it. So when we're talking about total power, we'll be able to increase it by 50%. So it's a geyser, it's a lever for the solar market. So in terms of solar production, it's a huge increase without using up more land area or rooftops. And we see the schema here in 2 words. We work with maintenance operators. You're in charge of the maintenance, so you see the flaws, you see what's wrong. So we get, warning signs. Then we have our own analysis tools. For example, there's the East Core tool that allows us to analyze real performance versus theoretical performance of a plant, and we can project what the production will be in the future if we do nothing.
On voit les pertes à venir, quoi,
So
finalement.
you can see future losses.
Les courbes se croisent.
And so you can see the curve. If you do the repowering now, we might be able to say, what will you gain, what will you save? And it's contractual, so it's more than 10%, but also fixing any normal, flaws in the panels or aging. So it's easy to show that you can earn 25 to 30% in one fell swoop.
Je parle même là juste de la puissance initiale. Et après, vous pouvez encore rajouter.
So you have your initial power, and then you can add an additional plant on the space that's been freed up. So we work with these maintenance team. We look for flaws. We carry out audits of these plants. We carry out studies. We'll try to define and draw the new plant, and we've got a full project. Helen said it, there's some legal challenges, so we accompany our clients who are not often energy professionals. So we help them throughout the project from a legal point of view regarding contracts, urbanization, material, to optimize the power. You've got to have the right material. You've got materials that will hold up better over time and that will produce more. And then we coordinate all this with different professions to carry out this construction site that can be more complex sometimes in repowering than in its initial construction, because we want to conserve a part of it, maintain a part of the material. We've got to oversee the fact that we don't want to lose any production. If we do this intelligently, we don't cut off the plant totally. We do it in pieces. And maybe we'll talk about this later, but we've got to manage the second life of these panels. And yes, we are going to speak about that. Thank you so much for this first part of the roundtable. We're going to have questions, but I'll keep them to the side. But some of them are very practical and very interesting, and I think all of you would be able to answer them. So we're going to end with you, Jean-Baptiste.
Voilà. Donc Jean-Baptiste,
So Jean-Baptiste, you're in charge of repowering, revamping at BayWa.
Voilà. Donc vous avez non, j'ai perdu mes feuilles, c'est dommage.
He's lost his papers, so he's lost his way.
Excusez-moi. Donc vous êtes le responsable Repowering.
So you're in charge of repowering and revamping at BayWa. The headquarters is in Paris. RE, which is renewable energy, so projects for wind turbines or PV farms for others and for yourself. Stakeholders, there's a German company selling agricultural machines, which is the origin of the company. And then you've got another Swiss partner who's an investor. And as for you, you started in PV farms in a consulting firm, and you came to BayWa in 2018 for operations and maintenance. So 100% of your time is spent on the only activity that is repowering. You talked to me about this being an emerging market. How did this market come about at BayWa? What concrete signs did you see? Well, we develop, we're constructors and operators in a 1 gigawatt farm of solar panels. So that's where I work, this plant that has needs. Clients, producers need guidance. They have, for flaws, multiple flaws or typical events, for example, frost or fire. And in all of these cases, they need technical solutions to be sure the plant is up and running and optimized. What do you see most often as a sign of flaws, technical flaws? What do you see happen most often? Mainly flaws of components that lead to lost performance. So panels lack of availability of inverters, and that's not necessarily linear. Something can last for 5 or 6 years, and then before it is out of service. But we were speaking earlier about the numbers and follow-up of the indicators. It's really, that's what it is. It's following up on these operations, looking at the performance, looking at the availability, because this indicators will allow us to raise the alarm when a modification is needed. And as you said earlier, what is the adapted solution? Is it heavy-duty maintenance, repowering, retrofitting? All of this depends on the diagnosis carried out. So it's individual to case-by-case basis. For inverters, we would think after 5 years, you might need to change it. Well, that's not repowering. That's just a normal lifespan of a solar farm. Yes, but there's differences depending on the plant. How was this all put in place? Is it set up right in the sun in the south of France? Or if it's the inverter in a more temperate climate, the inverter is not going to age in the same way. We talk about products, when we're talking about component flaws, it can be from the component itself or because someone's using it in a way that they're not supposed to. If you look at the instruction manual, it's not supposed to be used that way, so it'll age more quickly as well. And if I put myself in the shoes of someone working in a solar plant, whether I'm a farmer or a company, a landowner, when do I need to ask myself the question about repowering? This is a very naive question. I know it's complex. Is there something very particular? We spoke about it a little bit, mainly when you've got these first flaws that appear, for example, insulation. This type of flaw is a safety flaw, meaning there's a leak of the electricity into the ground. So there's a true risk for people operating in this plant, the owners or operators, and it needs to be fixed quickly and not leave it. So there's it's temporal. I mean, every season we might be working okay in summer, but not in winter. For example, it resolves itself in summer, but it comes back in winter. Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. So we're going to have an open round table, and I'll take your questions because there's one that concerns all of you. For authorizations of urbanization, when do you need to make a new request for a building permit? Is it the increase in power, surface area, or something else? Is that an environmental issue? I don't know.
Who wants to try and answer? Unfortunately, I won't have any black and white criteria. And it's a bit of a shame. So I think there must be progress on this subject, or governmental indications, because for the time being, the different departments have their own interpretation. But my first impression is that if we don't look at the foundation, the land coverage, and we try and attach the repowering operation to maintenance, in the sense that we're changing a lot of panels, but only panels, we could try to do away with a land planning authorization. And the problem is that if we're not 100% sure, a bank won't lend to you. Or in any case, the banks would issue doubts as to whether the project will be carried to term or not. So with regard to big repowerings on the ground, I don't think that we can do without this, and we can see the paradox. So we think, with roof repowering, it's quite obvious that we need to go and see the administration, and it seems contradictory to say that in the ambiguity of the text for repowering on the ground, we have nothing, whereas the impact is far greater. So we can see that for the time being, we need to make progress in terms of legislation. So when do you decide to go for it or not? Well, there are no really landmarks. So this repowering retrofits require new additional land, for the different equipment. But where it's less clear is where we have solar panels, where we have blue-tinted, which are blue-tinted, and we want to replace them with the same thing. So it has to look the same. So if I look at the roof windows, I just replace it with another one, yes. And in this case, things are not clear. So there are cases a little bit more tricky with farms with panel technologies that had matte, rather black colors, and when we replace them with the current panels that are lighter in color. And in terms of the intra-cell parts, it's sort of blue-gray, and that can change the appearance. So it's better to have a cautious approach. And regarding the environmental aspect, that would be paradoxical as well, because the environmental impact is when you build or the work site. So the question is, do we have to redo the impact survey from the beginning? That's very heavy, weighty for an operation that should be simple. It's use of land that is easy and accepted. But for the time being, we can see cases where they've restarted the impact from the beginning, because is it the administration who asked for this, or was it? Well, I think it's either the people themselves who decide to do it, or it's requested by the administration or by the banks. But the problem is that if we apply for a new permit and it is a unit that enters into the criteria where any new permit requires an environmental study, then we fall into the trap. But there are some mechanisms that were not transposed, because to accelerate procedures of repowering for solar on the ground, if we don't change the land covering, we respect the initial elements of the impact survey, we won't need to do an impact survey again. However, the difficulty we have is that the demands of the different measures, reduce, avoid, compensate, of impact studies that were done 10, 15 years ago. Well, first of all, the idea was that we would dismantle after 20 years. It was written in the impact survey. So can we, respect that without doing it again? There's a bit of a contradiction there. And these impact surveys were not as in-depth as what we do today. So, we can't, it's not sure that we can rely on these measures. But then what we were saying on the impact is that even if we're looking at repowering, all of the questions with derogation for protected species or the risk of affecting species, if they're identified during the work site. And we must remember this, because we have new risks that might appear during the repowering. So there are environmental questions with regard to the recycling, reuse, and ecological impact. What do we do with the old panels? And what do you do with the 32,000 panels? So Soren is the organization that reclaims these panels. So you have to reprocess 32,000 panels. Well, how did it go? Yes, indeed, most of the panels were reclaimed free of charge, and it's very well organized by Soren. And we have two other farms that are built in exactly the same way, where in the 32,000 panels, those which were not very impacted were collected to transfer them to the two other production units where we needed replacement panels whilst we were waiting for the future repowering. And so we kind of juggle between, what we could recuperate. So it's tens of thousands of panels. So how do they it's just at the beginning of all of this, I think that everybody remembers the responsibility of the producer, the fact that we pay as a producer for this. There is a tax which then funds all of this. But, you know, it's hardly off the ground. So how do they manage this concretely? It's true that I don't know what they do with them, and I don't know how the recycling happens. I just know that Soren collects them, and that went very well for us. And as I was saying, it's very well organized, and it's quite functional. Maybe Jean-Baptiste will have something to add to that. Yes, and maybe Antoine. So what do we do with these panels? Because the idea is what can we do with them? So the panels, you know, there's a problem of safety. It's a problem of the installation. So we can't put them back in the circuit, at least for the examples that we've seen. But in terms of volume and treatment, Soren is not alone. They have service providers. And so that will be the second link of the chain. They will look after the logistics flows of the panel. You're talking about volumes, but they reduce the volume. They remove the frames, and they repallet them to reduce the volume before they're processed, because 10,000, 30,000 panels, they don't have the processing capacity. They need to store it, etc. So they need to kind of smooth out the load because the volumes are too great for the sector. And so, yes, each sector is identified. There's aluminium, the cables go off for copper recycling, and we separate the glass from the encapsulating material. Antoine, do you want to add to this? Yes, I think to add to this, the question is, so among those that we remove, if some of them are still working, can we still use them? This is a discussion that we're having with Soren. The key point is the cost of the test, because the value of an old panel compared to the cost of the test to know whether it works or not. So what we're exploring and what we might imagine in the future are thermographic tests which are done upstream from so to see which are functional and dysfunctional, and then to sort them and prepare pallets ready to use pallets and ready to recycle pallets. So there are some practical questions that I'm looking at as well. With regard to practical aspects, is it possible to change the panels without changing the structures? I asked the question on your site, but it's also valid for you. So what do we do with the cables, with the higher voltages, with different voltages? So how far can we go today to keep as much as we can, and what do we need to... So yes, we could reuse the structures. We were lucky enough to find structures of the same dimension, which soon will not be the case. No, indeed. There are big changes in the dimensions. So we're lucky enough to find 32,000 identical size panels. It's not the same voltage, but we were able to make adjustments, and basically we redid a study to optimize the production of the site. But indeed, our fear was that we would not find the same size, and that was really the most important criteria. And so thanks to this, we were able to reuse the same structures, the same clamps, and the same fixation kits, and the same cables. The cables were reused in the same way also. So what is your feedback on that, on what we can keep? And for each project, we do a technical study with the documentation, and we look at our calculations, the width of the cables, the length, and there are different cases. Either we have a product that was sized with safety coefficients in the electrical calculations, and we will be able to use those cables. And if they're in a good condition, we will be able to reuse them. And sometimes we have to change them. So these can be replaced by new cables, and then we can have partial replacements, meaning keep good cables, but which are not in sufficient amounts or sufficient widths. And we rework the production unit with new cables, and we reinforce the existing architecture also. So an important point is often when we change the photovoltaic panels, if we're just changing the panels, then we just have to change the inverters, because we have times when the owners have made complaints to the manufacturers. They changed the panels, and 2 years later there was a problem of availability for the inverters, and they wanted to change the inverters, and they realized that the PV farm was no longer compatible with current inverters. So when you have to recable all of the panels on a farm, it's not financially or technically satisfactory. So we need to have full palettes to take the right decisions. Yes, this is what happened for us. So in the case of this farm, we had to replace the 128 5-kilowatt panels, and we found models of the same power. So it was a little bit plug and play. Just the commutation which was readapted, but I can confirm that it was necessary to replace the inverters at the same time. However, the question of the size of the panels has changed greatly, because now we have specific ranges of panels for ground-built farms, which are different from roofs, and that will be a question also in repowering in the future, because it raised financial and technical constraints that were non-negligible. So how can we kind of fix things with regard to the structure?
Pas spécialiste là-dedans, mais comme je le perçois, c'est effectivement les panneaux sont peut-être plus grands, mais après je pense que
yeah, so the panels will be larger now, but I think that it's a question of weight by square meter and surface area that will stay the same. So for me, the support structure can remain identical, but it's a question of the fixation clamps or the rods that are not positioned in the same place. Yes, the loads in kilogram per square meter are equivalent, if not less, but then there are specific cases of biface materials, but then it depends on the mechanical constraints, the external, the distance with the last clamp on the corner, and sometimes we have to adjust the rail or change them. So this requires a structural recalculation and a validation mission by an engineering office to control it that allows us to reassure the bank, etc. Reassure banks and also the insurers. And I have a question here. Isn't there a problem of responsibility when you use structures that are guaranteed for 20 years, and when we use them for 10 or 20 years more, we can, think about the story of inverters, panels, etc., and responsibility. No, it's your fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. Doesn't it give rise to some contentious situations with repowering, where there is a dilution of responsibilities regarding failures?
Pour moi, il y a la question des garanties.
For me, there's a question of guarantees. So we are setting off with the original guarantees, with the panels and the inverters.
Concernant les assurances, elles se basent généralement sur deux.
And regarding insurances, they look at two criteria: the value of the production unit of the farm, which I believe is increasing, and it is generally, the loss of yearly production that might happen. That's what's insured, and therefore, if there's repowering, we will expect more production in the year, so the value goes up. Both criteria go up in terms of reassurance.
Risque de contentieux ou pas?
Non, après je me posais la question plus.
No, I was wondering about, but maybe the subject is a bit different. Attempting to obtain a new tariff or apply for new low peak hours when we do repowering, which allow us to maintain the initial power on part of the land and to use another part to have a new farm that could apply. in the calls for tenders, there is always a demand for new installations, and to respect this demand for new installations, it doesn't prevent repowering, but it means that all of the equipment that is reused must respect or have a guarantee of good functioning that covers the purchase contract guarantee. So I don't know if this can be applied to the structures, but the idea is that everything that is reused, if we want to set off on a new call for tender with that, we must revamp things and have new insurances. We won't necessarily be able to rely upon the insurances that covered the initial lifespan. So there will be other subjects like this which will be raised with the optic of securing new tariffs. So keep the microphone, please, because the question of the lease, does it start all over again? Do you re-sign a lease? Or? Well, it depends at what point we are and what are the outlooks for the lifespan. If you have a lease over 30 years, for example, with the idea of that it should cover 20 years of contract and complement of pay and 10 years after, at what point do you do the repowering? If it's a repowering to maintain identical power because everything is covered by the insurance and you put the same panels back in and the outlook is amortization, which is the same as the initial investment, you don't necessarily need to extend things. But the idea is if you have new equipment that can set off on a new 20, 30-year period, or if you want to respond to a call for tender for low peak hours with a new tariff, you need to have a lease that covers the duration that you're expecting for the amortization of your installation. But if you're at the end of the lease or there's 10 years left, that's a question. And this raises a different question about public land. If we're looking at repowering in land in the public domain, they might need to launch a new call for tender, and it might be another operator that could win the contract to repower the existing farm, because we would not have a authorized extension of the lease beyond the amortization duration of the initial installations.
Alors, il y avait une question, je ne sais pas si vous êtes d'accord avec cette affirmation, des analyses montrent une baisse de la qualité de certains modules.
So we can see a drop in the quality of certain PV modules produced recently due to the pressure of cost. So what is the impact on repowering and the peak of activity that this
dans votre quotidien, est-ce qu'on va pas avoir du repowering?
So won't there be repowering? And so the the repowering wave not be even stronger. So what we recommend to our customers, and this is our objective, it's really to maximize the performance of these farms and limit any degradation. So we will recommend high, top-of-the-range materials with panels that last longer, deteriorate more slowly. I can understand.
Financement des projets, une tentation d'aller vers des coûts plus faibles. Mais je pense que quand on en a...
So, of course, we can always look for lower prices, but when we see that the unit has degraded faster than we should have, well, I think we have to be an approach where we're investing in it for the long term and make a conscious choice for quality. I'm optimistic. And I think that if some production units have deteriorated too fast, it shows that we need to use better quality material and equipment. Well, in our case, yes, the layer at the back of the panels was composed of a rather innovative material, which didn't really do its job. And so I think that this is an important criteria to look at what the panels are made of. Well, now we know this potential lack of insulation, which can happen with a back face that is not water or airtight. So today, the back face of the panels can be very complete, and I think that.
Je suis un peu prudent avec ce type d'affirmation.
Yes, I'm a bit cautious with this type of confirmation because, it's historical in the PV. We had all different technologies and trends, and we changed technologies quite quickly, and there aren't necessarily any analysis. And yes, these are things that we hear. So it's rather on the side of the lab.
Des tests grande échelle. Donc oui, les bons principes, c'est de...
So the right principle is to go and see the manufacturers which were present 10 years ago and which are still present, and that are among the top 3 or 5 in terms of quality for their panels. So we can start out with, we start out with some rather exotic or risky design hypotheses. So, fundamental question here. We're talking about reduction of objectives with photovoltaics. So even though the Prime Minister said, no, we're going to continue, we hear things about negative prices, that there might be too many photovoltaic panels at a certain moment of the day, there's too much production, but actually repowering of the current farms, could this not help us to achieve our objective? We don't need to create more farms. I don't know what you think. Could the government maybe encourage special tariffs for repowering? I don't know if this is justified from your point of view with regard to notions of surplus cost that this could give rise to, adaptations or things like that. So the question is, are the syndicates working on this subject? Well, they're not here, so they're not represented, but you are also members. I don't know if you have any information with regard to this. What do you think about this question on the pace of repowering to cover objectives? I don't necessarily have any answers to the question. However, one aspect that we find a lot is that there are high-power farms that we retrofit, ground farms, and there was no technology of there wasn't the technology of regulation of power that we can have now. So today we have a production unit, we have a negative price, and we can stop the production remotely in a few seconds, and we didn't have this opportunity in 2010. So when we do repowering or retrofit, we try to have this function and to add a line for the clients by putting this command control function, and this is to anticipate possible needs. If we have a lot of solicitations from network grid operators now and say, well, your production unit doesn't have the regulation function, it must have it, and we take advantage of the repowering to review this function. Antoine, I would say that if we are to be helped with specific regulations for repowering, I think that it should be done via storage. So we were well supported as a sector with guaranteed tariffs at a time when solar energy was not competitive. That's no longer the case. Today it is the cheapest energy or the cheapest electricity to produce. However, we still have this problem of intermittence or a shift with regard to the needs. Yes, I think that we have a real opportunity with repowering via storage, in particular for the new units, because we say, if you can help us, because the storage is still a little bit more costly, we know it will go down. We're in a transition phase. So you're reading my thoughts. That was my underlying question. Today, is repowering. I take my 2010 production unit, I change the panels, so updated panels and more power, and I put storage there. Not yet, because it's too expensive. Is that it? No, I think that we must put storage units in the new part of the plant, because it can allow us to remove the problem of additional connections and also to regulate the electricity production. So if we had to ask for a specific support, I think it would be that, rather than new purchase tariffs or whatever. I think that everybody is always looking towards post-purchasing tariffs. We have 5 minutes left if you want to ask any questions. So we do have a microphone in the room here.
pouvez, ouais. Donc il y a un micro qui est au fond là-bas.
There's a microphone there.
Voilà, ne soyez pas timide, c'est toujours le.
So don't be shy. It's always
Voilà, il y a une question par là-bas.
there's a question over there.
Juste ici. Là-bas. Monsieur qui est là-bas. Vous présentez là-bas.
Bonjour à tous. Merci pour
Hello, everybody, and thank you for this very interesting conference. I have two questions. I'm Patrice Kaya from APIM Energy. The first question for land planning. If we reduce the land capture and we reduce it, do we have a declaration to do? And the footprint. And the second is the cost of dismantling. Is this something that's very important? Well, for the first question, on the question of if you're on a roof, we do need to do a prior declaration because you're changing the footprint and the external aspect of the building. However, on the ground, we're coming back to the same subject as before. The law is not clear. We can read in between the lines that we don't necessarily need a building permit, but we do recommend that you go and see. Even though for environmental aspects, we would have a reduction of impact. So normally, there should not be any major difficulties, but I could not guarantee that we can do away with authorizations just because we're changing the footprint. And also, to keep the tariff due to changes in footprint, if they're projects for low peak hours, we need to ask for the agreement of the Ministry of Energy, so there can be additional constraints. On technical, practical question, on the cost of dismantling, this is quite significant, and some clients say, yes, we calculated our ratios, and they have all of these elements in the head. But don't forget that there's the dismantling, and it is quite substantial because the panels' efficiency has increased. We always have more panels to dismantle than to install, thanks to the changing technology. So for it to be recycled, they have to be placed on pallets and film them. And so there's the cost of panels, the cost of binding. And so as such, do you need to do a business plan for repowering? Because this dismantling part is very high. Yes, it's the greatest cost on the quote. There was a question. On biodiversity, we talked about that. Is there an updating of the part of the impact survey or not? Is it necessary or not? So maybe, depending on your experiences, on what you've seen, do they need to be reiterated? Well, if we consider that we are applying for a new building permit, we do everything right from the beginning in the impact survey and public inquiry. In that case, we redo an impact survey, but which will be more restricted, or at least restricted to the additional impacts linked to the modification of the production unit. So it would be related to the work site, and if there's a change in footprint, if there's an increase, and if there's an increase, what is its impact? But we don't necessarily need to start from scratch. So this is the theory, because in practice, we know that even if it was authorized 15 years ago, that's when the impact survey was done, the biodiversity environmental aspect will change also. And all the better. It's because nature has re-implanted on the site, and the site has changed since then. And so I know that we had a roundtable on the same subject with environmental engineering officers who were maybe more conservative than me and who considered that the work should be done again. However, there is a will to accelerate the procedures and in the law to try to limit all of this additional work. So that is still a point of tension, and we'll see how things change. So we are deviating from the ground units, but maybe to open up a bit. It's 429, so it's really the end here. because behind each professional and each representative, there is a private individual. And so there's a question on, for a private individual, can this type of problem arise in the same proportions and the same delays? And according to you, how often can this happen? Well, I would like to say, well, who can answer today a private individual on a repowering action? It doesn't seem very easy, does it?
La survenance du problème, elle est la même.
I think the problem is the same
Résidentielle que sur des centrales professionnelles.
for residential or professional aspects, but there is a cost of project management which is high, and so typically we do not respond to this quite type of demand because just the administrative side and the management of the land planning offices, etc.
Donc, bon, je vais pas parler pour les.
I'm not going to talk for residential installators, but I think that there is a question there of cost and project management with regard to the size of the installation, which is not easy to solve. So we have a question from the floor.
Normalement, il était ouvert. Allez-y.
Allô? Ah oui, vous m'entendez? Merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much for running over. I'm going to try and be quick. I have a concrete case study. Béatrice, I'm Guillaume Moldera. I have a production unit that we maintain and which was damaged by fire. It was a ground installation dating back to 2014, installed with thin layer technology and 90 watts. So we must replace the modules, and what we thought to do was to put 500 or 600 watt framed modules, but whatever the case, for us, it will incur a landscape modification because the modules are more powerful. And as you said also, they're not the same color. The appearance is changing. And so the fire, we're in a case where if there's a fire, we're allowed to change the modules, but I have the impression that the visual aspect of my production unit is changing. So I don't know if you partially responded, but I'm just putting the question on the table.
Un petit conseil gratuit.
Non, je suis un petit peu déçue de.
No, I'm rather disappointed to keep having to answer with doubt because I would like to be more affirmative. But if you modify the part of the structure, maybe the footprint will move slightly, and there's the external aspect. I would recommend not that you directly apply for a new permit, because it can be very complicated and all, but at least get in touch with the DGT and try and see whether it can continue without a new authorization. And we can see cases where this happens because, for example, for candidates for low peak hours, we can see that this they accept the former permit because but it's really case by case. And as with the administration, we prefer to prevent rather than have to take preventive action rather than curative action. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for your questions and for listening. Have a good end of this trade fair, and we will see you back here next year. Thank you very much.